Hello, and welcome to this discussion organised by the Constitution Unit, marking publication of our new report, Public Preferences for Integrity and Accountability in Politics. I'm Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. The report we're discussing today is the third from a major Constitution Unit project entitled Democracy in the UK After Brexit. That project, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council under its Governance After Brexit programme, is exploring public attitudes to the UK's democratic arrangements following some of the constitutional controversies of the last few years. The first report, based on a survey of over 6,000 people, was published last January. The second was based on the Citizens' Assembly on Democracy in the UK and appeared last spring. This third report again presents findings from a large-scale public survey and explores many pertinent topics, including integrity in politics and the public's desire for constitutional checks and balances. As you're about to hear, the results are very interesting. We're going to begin with a summary of those results, followed by some reflections from expert commentators. So first, my colleague, Professor Alan Rennick, the report's lead author and the project leader, will provide a whistle-stop tour of the results, illustrated by some of the graphics in the report. For those listening back afterwards or wanting to view the results at greater leisure, the report itself is free to download from the unit's website. There's a link on the event page, which should also now be in the chat. After Alan's introduction, we're joined by three very well-qualified people to comment on different aspects of the report. Dr. Hannah White is Director of the Institute for Government and has long-time interests in both Parliament and standards in public life, as well as across government and the Constitution more broadly. Joe Tomlinson is a professor of public law at the University of York. His work often spans law and politics, making him ideal to comment on the results on public attitudes to the role of the judges. And Paula Surridge is Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol, Deputy Director of UK and a Changing Europe, and is one of the UK's most insightful commentators on public attitudes towards politics. The respondents will speak in that order, taking just around 5 minutes each for their opening remarks. After all of the panel have spoken, we'll have a bit of discussion among ourselves and then open up to the audience for questions. If you're attending this event live and want to ask the panel a question, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom as opposed to the chat. Alice Hart, Research Assistant on the Democracy in the UK After Brexit project, will act as our Q&A facilitator, selecting a mix of questions and asking them on the audience's behalf. By default, we'll name questioners, but you can also indicate when submitting that you prefer your question to be put anonymously. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be made available afterwards as a video and an episode of the Constitution Unit podcast. You may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to anonymise your question. So that's more than enough from me. I'm going to pass to Alan to give us a summary of the results, and then following that, the commentators to give us their thoughts.
Thanks very much, Meg. So yes, I'm going to go through some slides very quickly so that you can see at least some of the results from the report. As those of you who've seen the report will know, there's quite a lot in it, so I'm not going to attempt to cover the whole thing in the time that's available, but I will do my best in the next few minutes. So I hope you can now see the slides. As Meg said, this is a report of 3 parts. So we're looking broadly at public opinion towards democracy in the UK. We started with a survey back in the summer of 2021. Then we held a citizens' assembly. And this report is focusing on our second survey, which was fielded at the end of August and start of September in 2022, last year. And that timing is quite important just to have in mind. So we're looking at the period right at the end of Boris Johnson's premiership. So the survey was conducted while he was still Prime Minister, but really in the final days and weeks before he ended in office. So in terms of the overall findings from the project, from the survey, there are 3 that we highlight in the report. So those are, first of all, that public trust in politicians and confidence in their ethical standards is low. And as it says in the report, there was overwhelming appetite for stronger mechanisms to uphold integrity among politicians, including more powerful independent regulators. Then second, the vast majority of respondents wanted leaders to be held accountable through a system of checks and balances, and most indeed wanted those checks and balances to be tighter than they are today. And third, The cost of living and the NHS were understandably people's top priorities, but they also cared about the health of democracy in the UK. And at least on one of our measures, they did so about as much as they care about matters such as crime and immigration. And above all, they wanted the discourse of politics to be more honest. The report goes through various specific institutions and aptitudes towards those. I'm not going to attempt to cover all of that here. So I'll attempt to say something about those 3 key points at the top. And then we can, of course, go into other points during Q&A. So first, on the point about trust and integrity. In both of the surveys, we asked, to what extent do you trust or distrust each of the following actors, following to act in the best interests of people in the UK? And you can see that even in the first survey in summer 2021, which of course was before Partygate, before the Owen Paterson affair and so on, trust in the Prime Minister and in the UK Parliament was very low. That trust went down further over the course of the year. Trust was somewhat higher in the civil service, markedly higher in the court system, and that didn't change terribly much over the year. And that higher trust in the courts will be something that probably becomes significant as we move on. Just to dig a little bit deeper into this area, we also asked people which comes closest to your view of these 3 statements. In general, politicians or business people or judges tend to follow higher ethical standards than ordinary citizens, or they tend to follow similar ethical standards or lower ethical standards to ordinary citizens. And each respondent saw either politicians or business people or judges in that, in place of actors there. And you can see views of politicians are very, very low. Most people think they follow lower ethical standards than ordinary citizens, pretty low for business people as well, but a much higher, strikingly higher view of judges. We asked in relation to the system of integrity, which comes closer to your view, that reform is needed so that politicians who do not act with integrity are punished, or the system for dealing with politicians who do not act with integrity should stay as it is. Overwhelming support for the former. And then more specifically, we asked, please imagine there are allegations that a minister in government has failed in some way, and each respondent saw one of the failures that you can see on the left-hand side of the graph there. So please imagine that a minister in government has arranged government contract to be given to one of their friends or bullied officials or so on. And then we asked, which, if any, of the following do you think should happen? And you can see in every case, a majority of respondents, an absolute majority, said that an independent regulator should be able to launch an investigation themselves. Of course, that's not the current system. At the present, there is an independent regulator, but the Prime Minister has to give permission for an investigation to start. Of course, most people don't know that. So most people don't know what the status quo is. But what we're getting here is a sense of their intuitions as to how the system should operate. So that was about how to investigate allegations of wrongdoing. We asked, please imagine there is clear evidence that a minister has failed in one of those ways, which which, if any, of the following do you think should then decide whether they ought to resign? And here the responses vary a bit more depending on the nature of the wrongdoing, the nature of the failure. So if it's inappropriate private life, failure to run the government department competently, then most people support some kind of political process for resolving that, though there's a variety of different political processes. Whereas if it's that they arranged for a government contract to be given to one of their friends or they bullied officials, then the most popular response by some margin is that, again, an independent person such as a judge should decide. Then I won't attempt to go through all of the stuff on checks and balances and accountability. I'll just focus in on the aspect to do with judges, which was provoked a lot of discussion when we published our first report. So we wanted to dig a bit deeper into this and explore these preferences further. So in both surveys, we asked, which comes closer to your view? Judges have an important role in ensuring that elected politicians operate within the rules, versus elected politicians must themselves be responsible for ensuring they act within the rules. And you can see support for a role for the judges increased over the year, presumably relating to the events that took place in between. We asked about the role of judges in respect of judicial review of government actions. So please imagine there's a dispute over whether the government has the legal authority to decide a particular matter on its own or whether it needs Parliament's approval. How should this dispute be settled? And you can see in both surveys, there's not very much change. Pretty strong support for the idea that judges should be able to decide. We thought there might be a little bit of a skew in how we had phrased the response categories that would push people towards judges. So we tried an alternative way of phrasing the response categories here. No difference with that one. Again, judges were clearly favoured. And then we also asked about protection of rights. So we asked, please imagine the government has proposed a new right and Parliament has approved it. Some people believe that this law violates some right or other, and different people saw different rights. So the right of women to equal treatment in the workplace, the right of pensioners to benefits, the right of terror suspects to a fair trial, and so on. Should the courts be able to decide whether people's legal rights have been violated as claimed? And you can see there the aggregate figures across all of the different rights. So a bit of a shift over the year. So support for the view that the courts should not have a role increased, indeed it doubled, but from a very, very, very low base. So it remained the case that a substantial majority of people thought the courts should have at least some role, either that they should be able to strike down laws that are perceived as violating rights, or that they should have the powers they currently have to return a matter to Parliament. Again, of course, we should remember most people don't know what the current rules are, don't know how the system now operates. So what we're seeing here is a sense of their intuitions as to how the system should be. But we wanted to get a little bit into whether this varies depending on the legal origin of the rights in question here, and also the courts that are doing the deciding. So we varied this question in some extra ways in the 2022 survey. So firstly, we varied the legal origin. So some people just saw the question as previously. Please imagine the government has proposed a new law and Parliament has approved it. Some people believe, etc., with nothing where you can see the word origin there. And they're the unspecified people in the top bar on the chart. Other people saw, please imagine the government has proposed a new law and Parliament has approved it, pointing to the UK Human Rights Act, some people believe that the law violates a right. Some people saw pointing to the European Convention on Human Rights, etc., and some people pointing to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is an international agreement that the UK has signed up to, etc. And we included that last point in the expectation that many people just don't know what the ECHR is and might imagine it is something to do with the EU. And you can see that these additions do make a difference to the results. So whether we talk about the Human Rights Act or the European Convention, more people, almost twice as many people, thought that the courts should not have a role. But at the same time, again, it is the case that you get a clear majority of people thinking the courts should have at least their current role in protecting human rights. And then we also varied how we describe the courts that are doing the deciding. So some people just saw, should the courts be able to decide whether people's legal rights have been violated? Some people saw, should the courts in the UK be able to decide, or should the European Court of Human Rights be able to decide, or should the European Court of Human Rights, bracket, a non-EU court that the UK is currently part of, be able to decide? And you can see whether we asked the courts or the courts in the UK didn't make any difference. Mentioning the European Court of Human Rights did make quite a big difference. So quite a lot more people were opposed to it having a role, though that reduced a bit when we mentioned that it's not an EU court. But again, it is the case that a majority supported a role for the courts in some way. I was going to say a little bit more about options for reform, but I'm going to skip over that because time is very short. As for whether people care about political process, how important people see these things as being, we asked, when thinking about politics today, would you say that issues around A or around B are more important to you? And respondents saw two of the things in the long list you can see there just randomly selected. So as I said at the start, cost of living, NHS come out top, but the health of democracy and the protection of human rights are there in the middle. And then more technical aspects, some more institutional features. If you look further down, you can see the balance of power between government and parliament, balance of power between judges and politicians, the system for electing MPs, things like that come further down. So people do clearly care about the quality of the democratic system, the health of the democratic system as a whole, even while they're not thinking in depth about particular political institutions. I shall stop there.
That is terrific, Alan. Thank you. There's such a lot in this report, and luckily we've got a bit more time to reflect on it. Even if you didn't manage to take in all of the detail, and you can follow up the detail later by looking at the report. But Hannah, let's start with you. These issues, not so much the judges, but the broad issues of sort of accountability and integrity in politics, very much the concern of the Institute for Government, like ourselves. And you've been quite closely involved, very kindly being on the advisory committee for the project, so you're very familiar with it. What do you make of this set of findings?
Thanks, Meg, and thanks for having me today to talk about this. As you say, is a fascinating wealth of detail, and I'm going to zoom in on a couple of the charts in my remarks, just because even looking at one, there's a lot that you can take from it. In terms of the project overall, I think it's been really fascinating, particularly the sort of double survey of the original survey having been done really before quite a lot of the sort of ethical scandals of last year came through, and then being able to take the temperature again from many of those all the same people, smaller set of the ones who'd originally done the first survey, but still sort of 4,000 of them just after all the Boris Johnson leaving office had happened, and to see sort of how that shifted. And actually, but also I think what's most interesting is how much continuity there is, that people thought these things beforehand, and some of it shifted a little bit afterwards, but really the wish for there to be more truth and honesty in politics, and for the system of integrity and checks and balances to be stronger was there beforehand, and it's certainly still there now. So I think that's really interesting. I just wanted to talk a bit about the chart, which is on page 4, if you've got a hard copy of the report, which Alan mentioned in his opening remarks, which looks at, really shows the public appetite, I think there is, for stronger mechanisms to uphold integrity. And the fact, I mean, the overarching interesting fact there being that if you ask this question, imagine there are allegations that a minister in government has done one of the following things: lied to Parliament, bullied officials, etc. Consistently across all the possible things that they might have done wrong, the public say that what they think should happen is that an independent regulator should be able to launch their own investigation to look at that. And I think that's really interesting on a number of fronts. So just sort of zooming in on it, across all these different potential things the minister could have done wrong, the percentage of the public thinking that the Prime Minister should just investigate as they see fit is between 3 and 7%. And I mean, that is where we are now, is broadly between that and the second category, which is that the Prime Minister can ask an independent regulator to investigate. And that was between 16 and 20% of people across these different categories thought that that was what should happen. You put those together, there's only about a quarter of people think that roughly what happens now is the right approach. And I think that there's been quite a lot of people, including the IFG and the Committee for Standards in Public Life and so on, who recently argued before the advisor on ministerial interest was most recently appointed by Rishi Sunak, that when that happened, they ought to be given stronger powers to be able to investigate misconduct by ministers, to be able to initiate themselves that sort of investigation, which is what about 50% of people are saying they think should happen. And Rishi Sunak obviously decided not to do that, given the choice. And I think it's food for thought for politicians now to think, actually, this is, maybe not where they wanted to end up, but it's where the public think they should be. And potentially we've seen proposals from the Labour Party for a sort of overarching ethics commission. And that, again, might be the sort of thing that people are thinking of. As Alan said, we don't have any detail and people don't really understand the system, but this is their sense of where we should be. It's interesting that is something that one of the parties potentially looks like going into the next election might be arguing for. And it seems there would be some electoral support for that based on this survey. So that's very interesting. The other thing I wanted to pick up out of that chart was the actually very low numbers saying that when any of these things happen, Parliament should be able to investigate. So those numbers were between 3 and 8%, including for lying. So if a minister is accused of lying to Parliament, only 5% think that a parliamentary committee should investigate, which is, of course, what's actually happening now with the Privileges Committee. So it raised for me a question of whether there'll be a legitimacy issue when that committee reports, whether people think it's the right thing for MPs to be investigating their own in that way. Similarly, there's a question around if ministers are accused of bullying their officials. 27% either thought that that should be investigated by the Prime Minister, or someone asked to investigate by the Prime Minister, which is, of course, what's happening at the moment with Dominic Raab and the Adam Tolley investigation. Again, is there a question of legitimacy of that sort of investigation if people are saying actually they think it ought to be something that an independent investigator can pick up on? And then one, as a sort of parliamentary enthusiast, the one I thought was really interesting was about if a minister is accused of failing to run their department competently, where only 8% thought that was for a parliamentary committee to think about. And actually, I think all the departmental select committees in the Commons would think that was squarely their responsibility to think about. So I think it's really interesting that that's not how the public see Parliament's role in judging ministers and holding ministers to account. And that's potentially a bit of a problem for select committees to think about, I think, if that's not perceived to be something that they would do well, or I mean, we don't know obviously what was in people's minds when they said that, but I think it's an interesting question. So the fact that over 50% in all these categories thought we should have an independent regulator, I think that's, to some extent, we can see that as validation of the success of things like IPSA, the independent expert panel that's been created in Parliament to think about bullying. Like actually that approach, which has been taken increasingly recently in relation to ethical standards issues, is sort of in line with what the public think might work. I think overall, I mean, we know this, but it shows that the public doesn't have much trust in MPs to sort themselves out in terms of ethical standards. Maybe that's less surprising, immediately after Boris Johnson was leaving office, and there's been a lot of discussion around him being responsible for adjudicating on his own behaviour. But actually, the figures aren't that different to what they were in the previous survey. So I don't think it's just about that. But I think there's also the strongest thing that comes through from this for me, and it also comes through in the second chart on the same page, which is if there's clear evidence of a minister doing something wrong, who determines if they ought to resign? And it's just it's a very small proportion of people who think that ought to be up to the Prime Minister, which ultimately, unless a minister chooses to resign themselves, it is up to the Prime Minister. And I think it's just interesting across both these areas of the survey how little trust there is in the idea that it's for a Prime Minister to determine ultimately on ethical standards of their ministers. Interestingly, just to finish, on the second question, which was about who should decide if a minister should resign when they've done something wrong, the place where people thought there was the most role for the Prime Minister to do that themselves was if a minister had been found not to have run their department competently. And I think that's interesting, because I think it doesn't seem clear to me that being able to run a department competently is a clear criteria for Prime Ministers necessarily in who they recruit to their cabinet. There are lots of other factors at play, but that is something that it seems, it's still the largest numbers were saying that an independent person such as a judge should judge competence. But I think Prime Ministers should think that that is very squarely a criteria when deciding who should be in their cabinet. And it was interesting that the public was somewhat in that of that mind as well. So I think I'll just stop there, but really interesting, and thanks for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Those are some really interesting reflections, and quite like to pick up some of that, but we must move on to the other panelists and let's see what they say, and maybe we can pick it up a bit in discussion. And anybody out there formulating questions in your head, don't forget to put them into the Q&A function for when we get to that part of the proceedings. But now over to Joe.
Thanks very much, Meg. And yeah, just to echo what Hannah said, it's a really fascinating report, and congratulations to Alan and the whole team on its publication. So I'm going to focus my comments on courts and human rights and what the report's findings say about those two issues. So just to focus on the findings in relation to the constitutional position of the courts. I think it'd be quite easy if you're reading in newspapers in recent years to get the impression that the public might be quite hostile to judicial review, to the courts involving themselves in government policy, challenging government policy. And there might be a concern that judicial review and the courts have a kind of public legitimacy problem. Now, if you look at the media, pretty much every week at the moment, there's some kind of story about how the courts might be put back in their boxes by government, or that there's been some case that's happened and the media have taken against it. And also we've seen in recent years an awful lot of political rhetoric aimed at the courts and trying to suggest perhaps that the courts have overstepped the boundaries of their rightful constitutional place. None of that is new entirely. There's always a dynamic within government that the institutions are sort of criticizing each other to some extent, and that's a healthy part of a democracy. But I think it's fair to say that there's been an uptick in that kind of rhetoric, those kinds of views expressed in recent years. So it has created this sense that potentially the courts are in this position where they have to think about public that's hostile to potentially their role within the constitution. And the previous report upended this narrative, and this new report confirms those previous results. I think that raises some really interesting questions about why that dynamic is there. So are the public coming to see the courts in the UK as part of a constitutional setup where they're comfortable with the courts having a fair amount of power, and they're more equivalent to courts in other constitutional democracies that we see around the world? Or is it more a case that trust in politicians is very low, and courts, in relation, seem a more attractive proposition to politicians having decision-making authority on certain issues? So I think it'd be interesting. These findings are really fascinating. I'd be really interested to see this kind of polling repeated over a longer period of time to see how these trends shift and evolve, or if they do indeed shift and evolve. One final point on the constitutional position of courts and the findings in the report. It's always seemed to me in the debates that I've been involved in around the role of the judiciary in recent years, is that what we might call the critique of the courts, the democratic critique of judicial review, is quite a simple argument to make. So the argument that people vote, they elect people, some of those people then get into government, they make decisions. If you don't like them, you can kick them out. But we don't want the courts interfering with those elected politicians and officials, is a really quite simple idea to communicate to the public. It's simplistic, but it's quite an easy and attractive democratic case to make if that's your worldview. The pro-judicial review argument, in my experience, is always much more complex to communicate. It's about trying to say we need checks and balances. It's about having an understanding of how government operates, etc. And it's always been the case, I think, that the democratic argument against judicial review is quite an easy one to make. And it's just my own experience of these debates, that often puts advocates of the status quo, or maybe even more a more expansive role for judges, almost on the defensive. They think they're wrestling with a public legitimacy crisis. I think these findings seem to suggest that maybe that defensiveness needn't be there as much as it is. Maybe there is quite a lot of public support for the status quo. Maybe there's something beyond it. Very briefly, on human rights, last time the results showed that people were more comfortable with courts deciding certain types of rights claims. And that's always been a tension within rights. Individual rights matter most as an idea in unpopular circumstances, but they struggle for public legitimacy most in those same circumstances. So I think it's interesting that that's been reflected in the data. On the point of the relevance of where rights are coming from, it was a very interesting finding, and one I've been sort of trying to think about explanations for, about why specifying the source of certain rights, Human Rights Act, Convention, and so on, made a difference. The report notes that that might be because those particular instruments have become associated with unpopular causes, negative reporting, etc. And one of the things that occurred to me when looking at these findings, it would be interesting to think about the idea of common law rights in this context. So judge-developed, court-developed rights, because I think it's particularly interesting because there's an argument that in democratic terms, common law rights are the least democratic form of rights. They've not gone through a legislative process. They've been entirely judge-made, but they do seem to, within our constitution, have a sort of, it's my own sort of taking it, seem to have a sort of legitimacy. The public seem quite comfortable with the idea of common law. So it's not a democratic legitimacy, perhaps, but a sort of historical legitimacy. And it's interesting to think about how common law rights might play into those kinds of findings. Final comment on the European Court of Human Rights reducing support when specified for court action. I think that's a really interesting point. It's not a surprising finding in my view, but I do think it needs some unpicking. One of the arguments that I think we potentially haven't discussed as much in the context of rights is the idea of, it is potentially a clunky way to express this idea, but the idea of localism. We talk about democratic deficits in rights adjudication sometimes, and how certain outcomes in particular courts might influence how the public perceive certain courts. But there's also potentially an idea we need to explore in terms of the proximity of rights adjudication to the people who are affected by that adjudication. So it might be something in the data here that suggests that it's not just about rights decisions per se, it's about where those decisions are taken relative to where the population affected is. I know, however, that there is generally overall strong support for human rights, another potentially quite surprising finding given the political environment. And that brings me back to my earlier point that perhaps defenders of the status quo or advocates for something beyond what the status quo currently is in terms of judicial power might not need to be so nervous about public legitimacy based on these findings. Final thing I'll say is more of this work, please. I think it's really interesting and we need much more of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. You say things like that, we'll invite you back. That was really, really good food for the discussion, and we'll get to it very shortly. But Paula, fascinated to hear your reflections and how this fits into the sort of broader sweep of research on public opinion, how it seems to you.
Thanks, Meg. I'm going to make just 3 comments on the report, trying to keep things brief, especially as the last speaker, to make sure there's time for discussion. And what I want to do really is zoom back out. So we've looked in some detail at courts and human rights and how ministers should be treated. And I want to just zoom out and try and attach some of that to some of the broader party political questions that are in the ether as well. So first of all, the issue of low trust. I mean, I don't imagine there's anybody here or, participants that are in any way surprised that you find low trust. But I think it's worth stressing just how low that trust has been over the last 12 months. So about a similar time to when your survey was conducted, Ipsos recorded just over 1 in 4, in fact, saying that lack of faith in government was one of the most important issues facing the country. Now that has declined a little bit since June 22, but that I think largely reflects all the other issues facing the country rather than people suddenly regaining their faith in government. But it's still high, it's still around 1 in 5, giving that as one of the most important issues. And one of the things I thought was particularly interesting about that was that it wasn't particularly young people that were saying that, it was across all the age groups. So there's definitely something in that lack of faith in government that your data points to, and that then as Hannah and Joe have talked about, there's potential ways of how can we rebuild that trust? Can we rebuild that trust, and how would we go about it?
But I think there's also some other questions there to dig into around, the extent to which it's party specific. Is it a kind of government opposition thing? So we know that the current government is polling very low. Would that itself be kind of tangling up into this? So there's some of those issues to unravel as well. Hannah pointed to the kind of quite high levels of agreement in terms of how ministers should be handled. There was more than 50% in most cases saying that it should be an independent review. So in some areas, there seems to be quite a lot of agreement about how we could tackle things. But what I noticed, and I'm going off of what Alan, away from what Alan presented here, but what I noticed in the report is that when you start talking about what I'm kind of putting under the umbrella of big ticket constitutional reform, so PR, reform of the Lords, stuff around local politics, it's a much more mixed picture. And even amongst, and it splits by party as you might expect, but even amongst Labour Party supporters, the responses to those issues are still mixed. So I think for any party that's looking at trying to rebuild trust through those kind of big ticket issues, the data perhaps tells them to tread carefully, because actually you've got to take people with you and they're not all quite there yet. So I think that's another thing that comes out of the data. And my own particular interests at the moment are around political participation and different groups of people and who participates and who has voice. And you've got lots of data on that in the report that, again, Alan didn't have time to go through here. But what that seemed to raise was that actually there's not very many people who want to participate more in politics than they currently do. And that outside of voting in general elections, participation is quite low. And it seemed that the reason for that was that they didn't feel they could make a difference. Most people who said they didn't want to participate more was because they didn't think it would make a difference. But I think you in the report break that down by EU referendum vote and party, but underlying those differences are differences of age and education and class and ethnicity in who participates and in what. And I think that's something that's really important to come out of the report in terms of when we're trying to put into place reforms and we're trying to give people more voice to perhaps build up trust in politics, it tends to be those who have high trust in politics who then participate. And how do we break that cycle or do something differently so that actually you're engaging people who are starting off with low trust? Otherwise, all you're doing is kind of reinforcing the existing divides. So those were the three kind of bigger issues that I picked out of it, and how we can then build those into programs that might change things and change both the levels of trust, who has a voice, and what that would mean in terms of those big questions of constitutional reform. Hope that's okay.
That's wonderful, Paula. Thank you so much. There are lots of things I'd like to ask, which are also a lot of them interconnected, coming out of what all of you have said. I think maybe it would be good to, it would be good to remind the audience again to put your questions in the Q&A function. I can see that some have come in, and Alice is going to be going through them, and I'll bring her in due course to put some of those questions. But for now, we're going to have a bit of a chat among ourselves, and particularly because of something that Paula just said, I think I'd like to start by bringing Alan back in and just inviting you to reflect on anything that the respondents have said, and particularly perhaps, given that I think it was rather tantalizing what Paula said about the mixed results on what you referred to as the big ticket items, which anybody who hasn't read the report won't know about. So I wonder if Alan could just, without going into too much detail, explain what lies behind that and say anything else in response to the respondents, and then I'll come back with some other thoughts that tie together some of what you've been saying.
Right, thank you. Yes, that was really interesting comments from all of you. Thank you so much. And yeah, Paula asked the question of how can we rebuild trust? And the slide that I skipped over there was the slide that I think perhaps says most about that. I could actually just quickly get that slide up on the screen if Meg will tolerate me having a moment of looking for it. Because I think
going
it's probably
into slideshow again.
It's probably easier if I describe it when it's on the screen. So I hope you can now see that.
Yep, we've got it.
Great. So we asked how much better or worse would democracy in the UK work if one of the things that you can see on the left, the politicians spoke more honestly, media reporting was more factual, etc. And each respondent saw, I think, 2 of these. So we didn't exhaust them by asking a whole long list of things. And I think what I found very striking about this is that the things that come out top are the more kind of behavioral, cultural type changes. So it would, democracy would be better if politicians spoke more honestly, media reporting was more factual, politicians lied less. Essentially the third one there, more people turned out to vote at elections, etc. And you get to the more institutional things a bit further down. The top kind of clear institutional thing is the voting system was changed so that parties were represented in parliament in proportion to the votes they won. And then you get various other institutional changes. And I think that just kind of points to the fact that changing this is going to be hard because the sorts of things that you can easily manipulate, I mean, easily you can change the voting system. And, you know, in theory, it is possible just to kind of switch the voting system. Of course, in practice, even that is incredibly difficult. And, you know, there's lots of debate about whether actually it is a good idea as well. But the sorts of things that are easily manipulable by those in power are the things that are less likely to be noticed by the public as making a difference, at least directly. Whereas something like getting politicians to speak more honestly, I mean, how do you do that? It's clear that it's not that people are just concerned about a few politicians who tell a lot of lies. They're concerned about there being an overall way of talking in politics that they just find very alienating and very off-putting. And how on earth can you shift that around such that people don't feel alienated by the discourse of politics? I think so to me, it just highlights that this stuff is really, really hard. And just in response to a few of the other things that Hannah and Joe were both saying, I think it is just worth remembering that people don't have a deep understanding of the institutions. They don't think about institutions most of the time. So, you know, we should always just be careful when we're interpreting these questions. It's not that people have thought through and decided that they don't like the idea of the Prime Minister making decisions about ministers, for example, or they don't like the idea of particular courts having a particular kind of view, a particular kind of role. On the whole, people haven't thought these things through, but what we're just getting from these questions is their intuitions as to what's good, what's bad, and they have a general sense very clearly that most politicians are not playing fair, are playing the system for themselves, and they want that to change in some way. I think it's probably more for us to think about what are the specific institutional arrangements that might deliver those kinds of changes, rather than trying to find those in the detail of people's answers to these kinds of questions.
Okay, great. I'm struck listening to this by how salient it is to the way that Rishi Sunak set himself up when he took over as Prime Minister. And he used that phrase, didn't he, on the steps of Downing Street on the very first day about wanting to lead a government of professionalism, integrity and accountability. And one could almost believe that he'd read the first report, really, because the first report suggested that that's what people want, and this report reinforces that. So I guess, I mean, there's a lot that we could talk about here in terms of what needs to be done and by whom, ideally, to rebuild public trust. You know, how new these levels of distrust are. We partially know the answer to that, I think, but we partially don't, because some of our questions are looking at it in a different way. And what, if anything, can be done to sort of turn things around? So maybe I could go to Hannah first, because you raised some of these thoughts in your remarks. I'm struck to think, if Sunak wants to kind of cut through and make people think that he is running a government of professionalism, integrity and accountability, what does he need to do? And a broader question, I think, which touches on what you were saying, I would put it like this: what if anything can the political constitution do to kind of redeem itself in the eyes of the public? Because I think it is very interesting, these results about the judges, and it's good that people think well of judges. But is that because judges are good, or is it because they've got such negative impressions of politicians? And Hannah, you specifically spoke about the sort of low levels of support for Parliament to sort things out and for the Prime Minister to be in control of things. Is it that maybe people's views will change if Parliament shows itself to stand up to politicians? You know, the outcome of the Johnson, the privileges inquiry, for example, will Parliament redeem itself if in fact it condemns Johnson, or if in fact Sunak implements recommendations against a minister without having to? Is it more sort of outcome focused rather than process focused? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then let's turn to Joe and think about this balance between sort of political and legal. And then I'll come to Paula.
Okay, lots of questions there. So in terms of what Rishi Sunak has to do to sort of fulfill this promise he's made, I mean, I think it's tricky, because in making that promise, I think he was trying to differentiate himself from his predecessors, and yet not to come out and explicitly, you know, criticize his predecessors. And a lot of the ethical conundrums he is now faced with are to do with the sort of backwash from the administrations that went before. So ministers that he has inherited and, yes, made decisions to appoint himself, or things which are to do with appointments or things done by Boris Johnson and so on. So he is treading this sort of political tightrope, aware that a lot of the grassroots of the Conservative Party still quite like Boris Johnson, apparently, and are in the process, some of them in some places appear to be punishing MPs who were sort of stood up against Johnson in terms of their reselection and so on. He's aware of that, but he's also wanting to, you know, to create his own sense of his new administration and so on. So it's a very difficult thing, and that's what he's actually trying to do. I think in terms of what the public notices, I think you're right that some of this, if the process produces the process we have produces an outcome, and the Prime Minister goes with that outcome, that is probably more what the public will notice, or rather they would notice the contrary. What they noticed under Johnson were the instances where, you know, like with Owen Paterson, for example, the system in Parliament produced a recommendation, and the response of the government was to say the system was wrong. And likewise, you know, if Boris Johnson sets up if the Sue Gray inquiry is set up, and now we have Boris Johnson saying, well, you know, the whole thing was unreliable. I think that's probably more what people notice is when the politicians seek to undermine, and I'm not saying this on the basis of what's in the survey, I just in terms of the reaction you seem to get. So there is probably something, if he doesn't want to make a huge deal about and sort of overtly criticize Johnson, he can do it implicitly by following the rules. There are also, as you said, Meg, a whole set of recommendations out there which he could adopt. And I think if the Labour Party, it looks as though the Labour Party is going to make ethics and standards something of an electoral issue, he could get in ahead of that by adopting some of the proposals that have followed the Greensill inquiry around lobbying, some of the things that CSPL has suggested around the ministerial advisor and so on. And doing some of that would, not take the wind out of the sails potentially a little bit of the Labour Party's critique. So yeah, I think I don't think I've answered all your questions, but I'll stop there.
Probably because my questions weren't sufficiently clear. I'm going to travel to Joe and then Paula, and then maybe bring Alan in at the end. So, because some of these questions are about the nature of public opinion and how sort of soft it is and what affects it, which is really Paula's bag and Alan's and less Joe's perhaps. So I don't want to be unfair on Joe. But this question about the political constitution and redeeming itself, I think it'd be interesting to have your thoughts on, and also leading into something that Paula might want to comment on. How important in all of this is kind of signaling, given how many people in the public out there are not engaged in the detail, they read the headlines. I think we can think about the value for politicians of signalling that they care about ethics in the way that Sunak was trying to do, and maybe signalling in the way the Labour Party is trying to do with its Integrity and Ethics Commission? Is that the way of getting through rather than actual change? And I think you can see that happening in some things like the small boats issue, where the government currently seems to be signalling that it doesn't much care about the views of judges, and it might even welcome a clash with judges. Do these results make that look like maybe not such a smart political strategy? Joe?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting tension coming out of the report in that sense. I guess just as an initial observation, and particularly in terms of human rights and the findings in the report, I was struck by how closely they reflect broadly, in general terms, the status quo, and in particular relation to the Human Rights Act. This is just my own view on that piece of legislation. It's not a perfect piece of legislation, but it was drafted incredibly well to navigate this course between concerns about democracy and parliamentary sovereignty and so on, and the protection of individual rights. And every time it comes under scrutiny, it is sort of this quite artful compromise between these tensions. This report makes me think that once again. And there's quite a lot of alignment there in terms of the balance between the legal and political, with the institution. The public intuitions align quite closely with the institutions that we have in very broad terms. That was striking. I think it's really important for me to say as well that there are real limits to what law and courts can do. They within a constitutional system, generally, courts respond to very narrow issues. The kinds of things that can be claimed are heavily procedurally restricted. Whatever certain things might not get up to the appellate courts and might have less of an impact, and so on and so forth. So I think that in terms of kind of balance between the legal and political constitution, it's really not the case that you can say we want a more legal constitution, that we have to care less about the politics, if you like. We're going to put more trust in law. It's really important that the political constitution, or the political side of our constitution, is something that it's the only space in which certain things can be done. So there has to always be emphasis on it. Law is not coming, and courts are not coming to save our political system. As much as some people might want that, that's not going to happen. So I think it's really important that we don't sort of, there's lots of, in my view, overblown critiques of juristocracy, the idea that judges are sort of becoming the central point of governments around the world. I think those are largely overstated concerns. But I think there's a grain of truth in those concerns, that we can't rely on judges to kind of maintain by themselves a healthy body politic. So yeah, I think that overall there's a kind of very important role for judges, but the findings in the report struck me as being very supportive of something broadly like what we have at present.
Interesting. You said juristocracy. I was thinking the other thing as well, technocracy. You know, we want the judges and the independent regulators to sort everything out because we don't like these politicians. But of course, that's never going to work. That's not democracy. So we do need to redeem public trust in the political way of sorting things out. Paula, what do you see in terms of the ways of doing that? How elastic do you think this sort of public opinion is? Can it be pulled back in the other direction by politicians doing something? And if so, what?
So I think that's a really interesting question, is the extent to which delivery might rebuild trust. And I think that's something that I think would be likely to happen, that people vote for change. We've had two dramatic votes for change in the last period, with the referendum and the 2019 general election, and then that change isn't coming, or things are getting worse, perceived to be getting worse, and that certainly undermines trust. But I think then you have to disentangle the issues of trust and delivery from the issues of integrity, which are, I think, a different set of issues. And the report seemed to suggest that, you know, people couldn't tell if politicians were telling the truth. They were likely to think that politicians weren't telling the truth. And there's this kind of it's a phrase that people like to say, that you hear in Westminster all the time, the idea you're playing politics with an issue. But actually, that's what politics feels like to a lot of people on the outside, that actually for those on the inside, it's just a game and they don't kind of take it seriously, and they're just trying to win and score points. And I think it's that element that you could perhaps work on, that we could look at ways of doing political debate differently. Many years ago, it was mooted that we might lose something like PMQs, which I think is, the worst of politics on display every week. And thank goodness most people don't watch it. But those are the kinds of things where I think some of the trust on delivery might come back if we have this government or a later government that starts to deliver on some of the things that people are concerned about. But that idea of personal integrity, I think, is where we also need to rebuild. And that's much, much more difficult, because it isn't obvious to me that delivering on a policy will do that. If I could just say one thing, because in the previous remarks to Joe, you talked about signalling, and so I'd written lots of notes to talk about signalling, and then you asked me a different question.
Do go ahead. No, I was taking those remarks as having entered your head. Feel free.
So what the data in the report showed was that actually some of this signalling works, and not to rebuild trust, but it works in the way that people respond to policy. So you said, should the Conservative Party be picking a fight with judges? Well, that depends on the judges looking at your data, because if you tell them that they're picking a fight with the European Court of Human Rights, they're much more up for that fight than if they're picking a fight with British judges. So these signals do work for people, and especially for people who aren't following the ins and outs of all the policy. But the upside, if you don't want to see the government picking a fight with international courts, is that even there, it was a relatively small minority that wanted that. It went up to about 30%, but that's still a small group within the overall British public.
Wonderful, thank you. I said I might bring Alan in again, and now I'm looking at the clock. We should get to questions, but would you like to throw any thoughts in before we do, Alan?
I'm very happy to go to questions. I could happily talk for a long time, but let's go to questions.
Okay, well, let's bring Alice back onto the screen. I can see we've had a bunch of questions, and hopefully you've got some good ones for us. Alice.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for submitting your questions. Hopefully we'll have time for 3 rounds of questions, but we'll see how we get on. So the first round of questions regards trust and accountability. We've had quite a few questions around this. So the first one comes from Jack Newman, who asks or says, given that the public know little about how specific accountability mechanisms work, to what extent can they be linked to low levels of public trust? Is there not a broader cultural problem with trust in UK politics? Our second question comes from Paul Evans, and he asks or says, it is interesting that the element of the Constitution that is least visible to the average Joe, i.e. the courts, is the one that enjoys the greatest trust. The element of Parliament that gets most regular media exposure is the glorified fight in a pub element of its proceedings. Is there a lesson about a need to insulate our constitutional guardians from the unrelenting contempt and misrepresentation of the media if they are to regain trust? Is transparency a good thing if it mainly consists of exposure and is a distorting pool of mirrors? And a third question comes from John Newham, who also talks about the kind of element of media and accountability. And he asks, on the issues of accountability, is the media an asset, a liability, or a confusing combination of both?
Wonderful. Since Alan was he's the person who has spoken the least recently, why don't we start with him, and then we'll come back to the other members of the panel who want to chip in on these points.
I think in answer to the question, why not start with Alan? The answer is they're really hard questions, so it would be very good not to start with Alan. So Jack asked about sources of trust, and is there a wider cultural thing rather than specific institutions being the problem? And I mean, basically, yes, I agree that there is a wider cultural problem, and just tinkering with a few institutions that most people don't know anything about anyway isn't, in the short term at least, going to have a significant effect. But it may have a bit of an effect, so there may be some signaling going on. So just kind of signaling that you're going to change the rules around the independent advisor on ministers' standards, for example, people may notice, okay, there's an attempt to do something differently here. So that may be, it may achieve something. But then second, if you can actually shift the culture through little changes here and there in how the institutions are organized, then potentially over the longer term, people start to notice that something is going on that is maybe a bit different, and that can help. But that does get into John's problem of the media. And clearly the media are absolutely essential in the system for providing transparency, accountability, ensuring that people are aware of what is going on. But equally in the UK, particularly with our print media and now with social media, on the online media as well, there is a huge amount of appalling coverage of politics that is very misleading, that encourages cynicism, which sees all politicians as corrupt and on the make. And once people start to have that kind of cynical attitude and kind of switch off from the question of whether maybe this particular politician is trying to do better, then you get into a vicious circle. Changing particular institutions can help, but if the media structure is not such that that kind of translates through into the kind of discourse that people are seeing, then you've got a problem. So I think we do need to think about how we can improve our media and social media environment in the UK, which potentially gets you to Paul Evans's solution of, well, just kind of remove public scrutiny and put everything back behind closed doors. I'm sure Paul doesn't really think that, but that could be one view, and that's also the kind of technocratic solution, that you dial down on democracy if you think that the democratic process just can't work. The alternative solution, and the solution that I feel much more positively towards, is you do actually try to improve the democratic discourse and the public discourse, getting back to what Paula was saying a moment ago. And many of the people on this call will know that I've worked a lot on citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy, all that kind of thing. And it seems to me that if we try to build more of that kind of activity into the representative system, so not trying to replace the representative system, not trying to do something implausibly radical, but building a more democratic process into the system, then gradually you can achieve shifts, including in how the media report. We've seen this to a degree, at least, in Ireland, for example, where this has been done. Potentially you can start to shift things, but we shouldn't underestimate how much you just need incremental changes, each building on all the others, that gradually shift the culture in more positive directions.
That was a very full answer, and I'm concerned whether other members of the panel are going to feel there's anything left for them to say, and we also want to fit in more rounds of questions. So indicate if you'd like to come in. Hannah.
Two very quick points. I mean, one, I do sympathise with people being asked to answer this survey, in the sense as I think Jack was getting at, in terms of none of us can confidently predict actually when you change a part of the system what it will actually do to standards of behaviour. So asking these people whose job it isn't to spend all their time to not only sort of judge what they would make of a politician deciding to do one of these things, but also whether, what effect that would have if they did it. I can understand why in your chart you showed us afterwards, Alan, at the top, people are focusing more on behaviour than on the
institutional stuff,
institutional changes for that reason. And the other point I just wanted to make, I mean, obviously, again, I don't think Paul actually believes what he implies in the question, but we've got to remember that transparency around these things isn't only about how that affects public views, it's also about the incentives it places on politicians. And obviously transparency places good incentives on politicians to do things if they think they might have to, be shown in public to have done them. It also, though, connecting to the media question, places bad incentives, given if we have sort of social media and it incentivizes people to behave in Parliament or in other forums in order to produce sound bites, not to engage fully in issues, those sorts of things. So transparency operates in lots of different ways, I guess, is the obvious point to make.
There is always a very ironic kind of transparency trap, isn't there? The classic thing about seeing how the sausage is being made. People don't much like it, but that's the nature of politics. There are some difficult decisions to be taken. Joe or Paula, do you want to come in? No obligation. Okay, let's go to another round, and you can throw in your thoughts on some of this at that next round if you like. Alice.
Yeah, sure. So this next round is going to look at other elements of the report and also some elements of methodology involved with it. So we've got 2 anonymous questions to start with. So firstly, the report contains a very interesting section that focuses on the relations between government and parliament. What did the results show, Alan, and how does the panel respond to these results? Our second anonymous question is some of the questions that were posed to the public, especially with respect to judges in the courts, are quite technical. Should we therefore be sceptical about some of the answers and by extension the findings if an ordinary layperson does not fully understand the question? And the third question comes from Estelle Breuer, who asks, are there similar or comparable trends regarding local politics, e.g. public opinion on borough or city councils, to those in the report?
Thank you. I think we may have no choice but to start with Alan again, because there's somebody there who wants to know the results that we weren't told. But I know that all of the panel have read those results, and I hope they'll feel well qualified to comment once Alan has summarised.
I'll attempt to be very brief this time. So we asked several questions about the relations between government and parliament, and essentially they suggested that people would like parliament to have, people's intuitions are that parliament should have a stronger role than parliament has at present in the lawmaking process and in scrutinising government activity. Again, we should remember that people don't know what role parliament currently plays. So, for example, people don't know that there's lots of delegated legislation that goes through with very little parliamentary scrutiny. But certainly their intuition, their overwhelming intuition of 3/4 of the respondents is that Parliament should always need to consider and approve changes to the law, which many people would probably be surprised by how much goes through without that. There was also a question about the technical nature of some of the questions and should we be skeptical of the results. And I guess I would answer that by saying, yes, we should be skeptical of the results to any single question. And we should always look at the questions kind of in the round. And one of the advantages of doing a big survey like this is that we can ask lots of questions about a subject, and we can indeed ask different variants of a single question, which allows us to see how slightly nudging the wording in different ways leads to different responses. And by building up a picture with lots of questions and lots of variants, as we do in the report, I think you can begin to get a sense of just what are the things that people are aware of, what are they thinking about, that does give a really useful guide. And just on the final question, we don't have anything on local level perceptions in this study, sadly.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to suggest that Joe and then Hannah come in on the responses to those findings on government and parliament, and then maybe we come back to Paula on the sort of questions about whether you can really have faith in results when the questions have been quite technical, and if you've got anything to say on the local. Maybe worth mentioning on government and parliament, because I can't resist it, the very strong results also that we got on the House of Lords, that people overwhelmingly wanted the House of Lords to be no bigger than the House of Commons, and overwhelmingly didn't think that the Prime Minister should be in control of appointments, faced with a choice between that and an independent commission doing the appointing. So there's quite a lot of interesting stuff on Parliament. Joe, would you like to go first and then Hannah?
Sure, just 2 very, very quick points on the courts. I think it's really, lawyers as a community, this is a broad observation, everybody's included in it, but lawyers as a community, I don't think have taken seriously enough the subjective views of the public in relation to legal institutions. So lawyers generally like to think about themselves as doing strictly objective work, thinking about law, thinking about how law develops, etc. But what people think the lawyers think institutions are doing really matters to how they behave. And we're getting an increasing amount of evidence on that. So in terms of looking at these questions and taking something from them, what the public thinks about these kinds of questions really matters in important ways to how the public feels, etc. And we need to take it as a valuable source of information. And a second related point is that there's an ongoing debate at the moment around if the government's rhetoric around judges and human rights has somehow chilled the courts, had a chilling effect on the courts, and whether the courts have become more deferential because of the rhetoric. I think it's a very complex debate, and I don't want to sort of open it up here. But I think it is certainly true that some broad sense of what the public feels, public sentiment, does at least set a climate in which the courts operate. And if you look back over history, the kind of development of modern ideas of things like procedural fairness, right to a hearing, really came out of a consensus in the 1950s and 60s that the administrative state had all this power and there need to be some more constraints on it. And so the kind of data that we're getting through these reports, I think actually helps us understand a little bit more about the actual public climate that we have at the moment as well, as opposed to the one we might get filtered through different media positions.
Hannah.
Thanks, Meg. I'm trying to remember, and Alan might have to come back in on this, but the extent to which you analysed when people are saying that they think Parliament ought to have more power or less power, those are people who support the current government or don't. Because I can imagine where people, the party you support is not in power, you might wish for Parliament to be stronger and vice versa. I seem to recall that the evidence from the parliamentary, from the Citizens' Assembly, though, supported this, where people will have been taken through, taken through much more detailed explanations of all this. So you would expect that the fact that those correlate to mean that that's a more robust answer, but I just wanted to let Alan come back on that specific point.
Yeah, so on most of the questions to do with government and Parliament, so on all of them, you're right that Conservative voters were more inclined to support the government and a role for the government. But on most of them, even Conservatives thought that Parliament should have a greater role than it does now.
I think what this means is the SRC needs to fund another round of the survey if and when we get a change of government to see what changes.
Absolutely. I'm very much in favour of that thought.
I think there was even one of the House of Lords questions where Conservatives came out more strongly for change than other groups. So yes, it's not as sort of polarised as many people might assume. Can I bring Paula in? I think you're going to be the final person, Paula. Any thoughts that you have on trusting results on technical issues or anything on local, or indeed anything else you want to throw in before we wind up?
Well, I think the thing I will throw in, because it cuts across all of these questions, is that all of us here need to recognise how very unusual we are in our level of interest in politics and knowledge about politics. And that does cut into the questions you can ask. But Alan's been really clear not to use individual items in isolation, and not to think that because you found 52% of people in favour or opposed to something, that definitely means there's a majority one way or another. And you have to have that kind of allow for a little bit of noise in the results, because people might misunderstand questions. I mean, for example, when I read the report and there's that stuff about wanting to participate in politics, what do people think that means? Do people think that means being a school governor? Do they think it means getting involved in a local food bank? What do they think being involved in politics actually means? So I think when we're talking about the results, when we're talking about how people answer the questions, and when we're talking about how we can rebuild trust in politics, we just always need to just kind of take a step back and go, but actually, most people are not thinking about this even once a week, never mind the kind of daily that we all are. And just remember that when we're thinking about how we can make change. Change has got to happen by sustained change. A one-off difference in the tone of PMQs is not going to register with most people. So it's got to be that sustained and probably gradual change to make those differences. I hope that's okay. I don't like being the last person to speak.
We like you being the last person, the middle person, and the first person, Paula, and we hope you'll be back at some time in the future to do one of those things, along with our other speakers who have all been wonderful. Many thanks to Alan for such a succinct and beautiful presentation of the results, but particular thanks to the 3 external speakers who have helped to chew it over. I hope that you've enjoyed this event. As has become clear during the discussion, there's plenty more in the report that we haven't had time to look at in detail, so do go and have a look at it on our website if you haven't done so already. As I said at the start, this event will be available in video form, and it will also be an episode of our podcast. So if you've enjoyed it, you can listen again, or you can recommend it to other people to listen to and hear more about the findings in the report. Our next events are unusually coming up very soon. Next Thursday lunchtime, 23rd of March, we've got an event marking the publication of my new book with Lisa James, The Parliamentary Battle Over Brexit. Alongside us, the authors, the speakers are going to be former Justice Secretary David Gauke, SNP MP and litigant in the Supreme Court case on prorogation, Joanna Cherry, and Dr. Robert Saunders of Queen Mary University of London. And on the evening of 29th of March, there's a second event on the book, both live and online, organised jointly with the UK and A Changing Europe, featuring Graham Brady, Gavin Barwell and Isabel Hardman. So if you'd like to attend either of those, please visit the events area of our website. But finally, just to reiterate, huge thanks to our panel. Thank you to the audience for being here. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. We hope to see you at one of our events again soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.